Gospel of John, where we are traveling through, and it's again this invitation, even calling the series over and over. You see this invitation to come and see who Jesus is, come and see what he has done, and all these signs are talking about these miracles that he is doing. All the discussion are just unveiling more and more of his identity, who Jesus is, what he's done, and then why does it matter? What's the impact on us? And what today we're going to look at in John chapter 6, the first part of it is Jesus meets our needs. He meets our needs. I've loved all of John, so I'm not like, hey, I've got one favorite of this, but like just something's really resonated with me this week, probably more on a personal level as I've just studied through this, as I prayed through it, as I've just thought about the promises that we see here. I don't know if it's for Karina and I's experience the last 15 years as we sought to go plant the church and be here, that we've just seen God provide and care for us over and over and over again. We're in the middle of a couple things that we're trying to make choices on, and we have this deep assurance that God's going to provide for us, that God's going to care for us. It doesn't make the circumstances less challenging or the decisions we have to make less impactful, but we make these choices with this assurance and conviction and trust that God will take care of us. So I pray and I hope that you are encouraged. I hope that you have an assurance that you experience because of who God is and what he has done for us, what he has promised us. Backtrack a little bit in chapter 5. It was this revelation of who Jesus is. He was very explicit that I am God. I am the Messiah. I am God incarnate that is here. And then we'll spend the next about 3 weeks in chapter 6. And what chapter 6 does is like, okay, if chapter 5 is Jesus is God, then chapter 6 is like, okay, how do we receive him? What is he calling us to? How do we respond to this proclamation that Jesus is God? And at the center of it all is, we won't get to this today, but this is where we're going. In chapter 6, verse 29, it says, this is the work of God, that you believe in, that you trust yourself to him who has sent you. They're like, hey, God, what do you want us to do for you? Hey, this is the work that God is asking you to do, to trust him, to believe him, to put your faith in him. That's at the center of it all. Frederick Bruner in his commentary says, we enter into the life intended by God for human beings, how God intended life to be. We enter into this life by trusting his son. That's what God promises him. The call, the work of God for us is to believe in him, to have faith that he is who he says he is. And leading in this call, like, does somebody ever ask you, like, to trust him? Like, you ever have, like, hey, you can trust me, like, what's the first question? Like, well, why can I trust you? Like, what have you done and who are you? Like, why can I trust you? And we should ask the same thing of Jesus, why can we trust him? And that's where he starts in verses 1 to 21, why we can trust him. And so we'll go through, we can trust him because he cares for us. We can trust him because he satisfies us. And most importantly, we can trust him because he's the king. He's the king of all creation. That old song, he has the whole world in his hands, it's true. And so because it's true, we can trust him. There's a couple little background notes that kind of set the context of this passage and why he's talking about it. And one of those that kind of struck me as I was looking at it, in verse 2, it says that he went away to the other side of the sea. And then in verse 2 it says, and a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. So it says this large crowd was following him, and we'll learn that it's 5,000 men, and then there's all different like opinions and background of like, okay, that could mean that's up to 20,000 people because they would just count the men, and then there's the women and the children, and so there's minimum 5,000 people, up to 20,000 people coming for Jesus, following Jesus. They would have had to walk like 5 to 8 miles to see him. I'm like, man, we got churches that like jump through hoops trying to get anybody to come and hear about Jesus. And we got thousands of people walking numerous miles just to be with him, just to hear from him, just to be near him. And so I started asking, why? And it says, because of the signs he was doing on the sick. So there's some of those that are being healed. They're sick. There's a paralytic that we talked about that was by the healing pool, and he was sick, and Jesus healed him. And so there is like one level of sickness and physical ailment that's there. But as I was thinking about this more and more, if we're honest, everybody's sick, right? The word sick there, it talks about being weak. It talks about being needy. It talks about being without strength. It talks about being powerless. Anybody have felt that? You feel weak, you feel needy, you feel powerless? I'll come back around to this, but we were, once a week, we do a call with other Crosspoint congregations. It was a preaching call. We would call and it's like, hey, we would pray through the text and just kind of talk about it. We're all in kind of a different series now. And so now it's just been, we go through a book together, or we just pray for one another, or we just update how you're doing with your families and things. So we're going through a book on leadership and on being an elder and how do you have a culture of grace and as leaders. And this chapter was on restoration. There's a whole chapter on restoration. And where the chapter went was, hey, there's a pastor, he's drinking at the office, he's kind of passed out on his desk, and then somebody walks in and it turns into this big thing, like, just FYI, that happens. Or like there's an affair and the pastor does this. And so like they're talking through these very big, very important, very significant things that happened, and which I don't think I'm above anything. I'm like, hey, somebody else got there, I could get there too. So what do I need to do? But I kind of stepped back and I asked a question. I was like, I'm not passed out on my desk, and like, I love Karina, and I'm like, there's nothing there, like, but I was like, but I also feel weak. I feel like I need strength. I feel powerless in a lot of ways. Just this past year, there's plenty of articles about pastors and just about people in any industry, just what this last year has done to us all. And so we feel weak. We feel like we need strength. We feel powerless. One of the other pastors said he'd been listened to a podcast from a counselor, and they brought a guy on, and this guy's a little controversial, so he's a counselor type. And so those who are like the kind of my streams, theological and like know the right thing, we get skeptical of the counselors that kind of start talking about feelings too much and that. So anyway, there's some, not signing off on everything this guy says, but a counselor named John Eldredge, kind of famous book called Wild at Heart. There's some theological issues there, but he wrote a new book. It's called Get Your Life Back. And he is talking about this very idea. And he talks about Jesus's admonition in Matthew chapter 11, where he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my burden upon you because it is light, and I am lowly at heart." And so in the introduction of this book, elders ask this question. He also refers to 1 Peter 5. It says, "Cast your cares upon me." There's this call to be carefree, to be light. And elder says, he asks these questions like, are you happy most of the time? He says, if there's this call, my burden is light. He said, how often do you feel lighthearted? He says, are you excited about the future? He says, do you feel deeply loved? These are all these promises that are mixed up that Jesus gives to us. He asked, this one was convicting to me, when was the last time you felt carefree? Before the service, it was raining out, and our youngest 9-year-old was on that swing, swinging his little heart out in the rain. He was carefree. And I was like, I do not know the last time I felt like that, right? Why? Because we're all weary, we're heavy laden. Elders goes on, he says, I know it's not even a fair question to ask. He says, our souls are bleary, seared, and smeared. He says, this frantic, volatile world constantly wilts the soul. it dries it out like a raisin. The immediacy of our world. He talks about just even the idea of how we communicate with one another. You'll get a text message from somebody, and what used to be a conversation where you can kind of nuance some things, like people just send a text, you're like, are they mad at me? Do they hate me? Like we don't even communicate that. Or just say like work email, like we're constantly tied to it. We never get a break from it. It's continually going. You're checking before you go to bed, and then you're dreaming about it, and you're waking up to it. Like the pace of our culture wilts our soul. And so we need to get to a point where we realize that we're in need. I think that's one of the challenges in our culture, in our world. Oftentimes we don't even know we're in need. These people are coming to eat bread and get the fish, but they don't even know that they're hungry. Right? So there's this large crowd following because they knew they had need. And we're the same. The second thing that's like kind of a side note underneath this whole thing, and it does this 3 different times in the book of John. It says in verse 4, it says, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. It says the Passover was at hand, and that would have triggered the audience. They would have had a Jewish background, and 2 things that we'll see in this passage that would have triggered with the Passover would be water, right? They're in the boat, they're going back. It kind of gets tacked on at the end. You're like, wait, why is this really famous story in the middle of him talking about being the bread of life? The Passover would have been God delivered his people through the Red Sea, right? The other big provision that we see in the Exodus is that God fed his children, the children of Israel, in the wilderness. He said he gave them bread from heaven. And now Jesus is coming and saying, I'm what? I'm the bread of life. So the water and the bread would have set sort of like the sirens off in their head, like, hey, this reminds us of the Passover. And the Passover was where God delivers and God provides for. And Jesus is saying, I will deliver you and I will provide for you. I will meet your needs. I will meet the needs of my people because I care about you. And that's the first thing we see in verses 1 to 9, that Jesus cares. Look at verse 1 and then jump down to 3. It says, we see that Jesus cares about his followers. Look at verse 1. It says, after this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And then in verse 3 it says, Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Jesus went away from these crowds. He's been healing people. There's all kinds of people following him. And what does he do? He goes away from the crowds, and he sits down with his disciples. Was there stuff to do? Obviously, 20,000 people are following him. There are some things to do, but what does he do? He cares about his followers, so he sat down with his disciples. In the same account in Mark chapter 6, verse 40, it says, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. Jesus cares about his followers. He cares about us. He invites us. He calls us to go away with him, to sit with him, to be with him, to rest in him. In our frantic pace of life, what's difficult? Stopping to be with Jesus. There's another pastor thing a few weeks ago. They're like, hey, what are different things that you do to help to be with Jesus? And I was like, this sounds kind of weird, but we're creating these little sitting areas around our house and in our yard for connection and community. Like just places that we can just go sit with another person, with another thing. And so we got this little thing going on in the backyard. And we got these Adirondack chairs in the front. We got 2 chairs in our room. And why? So we can stop. So we can sit. So we can connect. Jesus loves us enough that he invites us to do that. Why? Because we need it. What we're doing right here, he calls us to what? Step away 1 day a week. To what? Stop. to rest, to be with him. I got a friend that's going through some stuff and got some health things going on, and I was like, one of my things, I'm like, hey, just start coming to church with me on Sunday. Just start coming. Coming to church, being here is a declaration that there is a God and I'm not him. There is a God, I'm not him. He's going to care for me. He's going to care for all things. Jesus cares for us, and he invites us to stop, to rest. Verse 2, we see that Jesus cares about the broken. Large crowds following him because they saw the signs he was doing on the sick. The broken, those that are most in need. It's been interesting as I've been praying through this passage. It even talks about like the bread was barley. It would have been like the bread of the poor. This pandemic, this past year, has been really difficult on people that have means to get through. We have means to work at home. We have means to pay our bills. It's been very difficult. And the more I thought about this, I was like, but what about the poor? How do they find rest? How do they stop? Often they don't. Got to keep showing up to work. Got to keep going. Got to keep providing. There's nobody going to help out. And Jesus cares about the broken. And again, in the Mark account, this comes after he had sent the disciples out in his name. And so as Christians, we need to ask the question, do the poor know that Jesus cares about them through us? Do those that are in need come to us? Better question, do we go to the poor? Do people, the broken, know Jesus cares about them in and through the church, the body of Christ? Because it's here and it's everywhere. Jesus cares about the broken. Jesus cares about the outcast. Jesus cares about the immigrant. Jesus cares about the broken. Verse 5, we see Jesus cares about the people he is trying to get a break from. How good is he? He leaves the big crowd. Why? Because he needs to get away. And then what happens? The big crowd follows him. He's like, no, you're the one I'm trying to get you guys ever get that? You're the one I'm trying to get a break from. And look at verse 5. It says, lifting up his eyes then and seeing what the large crowd was coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? The very people that Jesus was trying to get a break from, he cares about. He wants to provide for. Verse 6, we see Jesus cares about growing the faith of his followers. Look at verse 6, He said this to test them, for he himself knew what he would do. So they're going on. There's all these people. It's like, hey, how are we going to feed them? He's like, you just watched me heal everybody. You just watched me perform all the other signs. If you're newer to Crosspoint, Jeremy Agan oversaw the Bible department here at Jupiter Christian, and he would preach for us every 5 or 6 weeks or whatever. And he wrote a book called Opportunity Jesus. And so I think this is another reason I like this passage, because I went back through it just to say, like, hey, what are some things going on here? And it just reminded me of Jeremy. And he's brilliant. And so Jeremy asked in the book, he says, Jesus is fishing for, oh, Jesus, you can supply all our needs. We trust you fully. He wants to grow the faith of his followers. That's not the answer that they give. But Jesus cares about us growing in our faith. He cares about us trusting him more and more. In this test, his followers don't pass. We see in verse 7 to 9, Philip doesn't know what to do. He's like, hey, that would cost a whole lot of money. to feed all these people. It says, Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get even a little. And then Andrew doesn't know what to do either. Andrew says, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? So again, he's not trusting, he's not seeing it for Jesus. But Andrew gets a step further because what he does have, he brings it to Jesus. What little he has, he's like, hey, a couple fish and 5 loaves. Jesus, this is what we got. And he brings it to Jesus. Why? Because Jesus cares. And Jesus can do something with it. And T. Wright put it this way. He says, the point is obvious, but perhaps we need to be reminded of it. So often we ourselves have no idea what to do. That resonate with anybody? We have no idea what to do with work. We have no idea what to do with school. We don't know what we're going to be doing over the summer. We have no idea what we're going to do with certain circumstances or relationships, marriage. Sometimes you just don't know what to do. Parenting. A lot of times you have no idea what to do. We're quite often in over our heads. Wright goes on, he says, but the starting point is always to bring what there is to the attention of Jesus. They had a couple fish, they had a couple loaves. What'd they do? They brought it to the attention of Jesus. He says, you can never tell what he's going to do with it next. So no matter what the circumstances, no matter what the challenges are, the call is to know that Jesus cares. And if Jesus cares, we can bring them to him, no matter what it is. So we need to ask, like, where do you have a need? Where do you have need, like, right now? Where are you confused? Where don't you think you're going to make it? We need to ask ourselves, where do we tend to turn when we have need? I tend to turn to myself. Well, I can do that. I can figure that out. Or we can get through this, right? And then I'm exhausted and tired and overwhelmed. Jesus says when we're in need, when we don't know what to do, to bring it to him. Why? Because he cares for you. Cast your cares upon him, for he cares for you. Let's awkwardly sit in that for a minute. God cares for you. Is that how you think of God? As a father who cares. I care about my kids, and quite often they bring stuff to me, and I don't know what to do. Good news about Jesus, he's God. He does know what to do. Not only does he care, he's got the power to do something about it. And ultimately what we see in the story is that Jesus satisfies. He meets our need. Verse 10, it says, Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in that place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. And verse 11 says, and Jesus then took the loaves, and we had given thanks. He distributed to them, to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. Verse 12, and when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. So there's these 5,000 up to 20,000 people. Verse 11, he took the loaves and the fish, and it says that he gave thanks. There's people tie this to, and I would like to the Eucharist, to communion. It's the same word. What probably is really going on, he's giving thanks to the source, the Father who has given us all things. So he gives thanks to his Father, and it says that he distributed them to them as much as they wanted. Verse 11 said that they had eaten their fill. Another way to say it is that when they were satisfied. So Jesus doesn't just give them enough. What does he do? He satisfies them. He fills them. He gives them more than they could even have asked for. He satisfies. It says that they filled with 12 baskets. And there's all sorts of things that people take, and maybe they're partially there. It's like, oh, that's like the 12 tribes, and it's like the 12 disciples who are going to go out into the world and bring the word, and some of that could be in there, but at the core, at the heart of it, it's stressing the lavishness of what Jesus supplies. It's stressing the satisfaction that they had. They had eaten their fill. They had an abundance. Again, remember, there's these tithes, there's the bread from heaven. Remember what they get? There's got little bread coming down. They had an abundance of what they needed. Jesus provides. Jesus satisfies. Jesus meets our needs. And he doesn't just meet our needs. He over and over again provides more than we can ask or imagine. We've been 15 years, we have seen a lot. A lot of times we didn't know how or where or when. But over and over again, God has provided. Not in ways that we thought, but it's been more than we could have ever asked or imagined. Doesn't mean it hasn't been difficult and hard and circumstances of unknown, but he provides. Jeremy, in his book, Opportunity Jesus, I like that I just get to quote him. It says, Jesus can supply our needs plus more. It says, Jesus feeds the 5,000 until they are satisfied and has much left over. He can supply our needs the same way in any area of life if and when we trust him. So we need to go back to that first question. Where do we have need? Do you have needs in relationships, in circumstances, in your health, in your physical, in your emotional, in your spiritual health? It says Jesus can meet them. Jesus satisfies. And while the main point of this passage, this text, is that Jesus provides for us physically, in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. That's the crux. We can have rest, we can have trust, we can have peace because God cares for us and he provides for us. But like every passage of Scripture, it's all a pointer. It's all a pointer to Jesus meeting our ultimate need. He didn't just come to meet our physical needs, right? He meets our spiritual needs as well. Verse 14 said that they sought to make him king. It said what's going on there, they wanted him to deliver them from the rule of the Romans that they were under. They try to politicize Jesus. A side note, one commentator said that every political season, all political seasons are testing seasons for all disciples. Because people do the same thing. Whether you're a Republican or whether you're a Democrat, what do? They want to hijack Jesus to meet their agenda. And that's what's going on here. And Jesus is like, that's not why I came. I came to establish my kingdom. I came to bring life. This provision of Jesus ultimately points to the cross. Right? Because on the cross, Jesus took his one life and gave it. His body was, Larry and I were talking this about Friday, his body was given for us. He gave his one life to bring life to many. When we trust in him, when we believe in him, he takes our sickness, he takes our sin, he takes our grief, he takes our shame, he takes all the things that take life from us, and he pays the penalty for it. And he resurrects, and he defeats it, and he's reigning and ruling, and what does he do? He pours out his Spirit to give new life, to meet our need, to not just cover our sin, but satisfy us, to give us what we all really need, which is life. We're all in need. And Jesus meets our need, and he satisfies us. To turn to him. And the call of the Christian is to see him for who he truly is. When we see him for who he truly is, we know he'll meet our needs, and we know he satisfies. I just kind of thought it was weird. He's like talking about the bread of life, keeps talking about the bread of life, and then in the middle of it, he gets on a boat. The guys get on a boat, and they go across the sea, and then all of a sudden, Jesus is walking on the water. It's like his most famous story, but it's like this little snippet right in the middle of the whole thing. We need to see, and what this is displaying is that Jesus is the King. He's above all of our needs. We need to see him for who he truly is. This account is a display of this. And it says, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. They got into a boat and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. It says the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing, and when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near to the boat until they were frightened. It says, but he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." It says, then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. We can trust that Jesus meets our need because he's in control over the chaos. The sea, the water, that's all symbolism for the chaos of the world. It says Jesus was walking over it. He's in control over it. He's in control of all of creation. All the frustrations of the world, Jesus is in control of. And he's working all of them for his purposes. So we can rest. Jesus' mere presence removes fear. It says that they saw Jesus walking on the water, coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." He says, "It is I." It means I am. It's Exodus 34. And we'll start seeing this now. It's like the first hint of what's coming in John. I am God. Because I am God, don't be afraid. Whatever the worries of the world are, he's with us in the midst of them. Does it mean that you won't have trouble? No. That's going to keep on keeping on, right? It's not, I watch people who are older than me. Doesn't slow down. But Jesus says what? The promise, I am with you always to the end of the age. We remove fear with Jesus' presence. When we trust Jesus as King, we can be carefree in the midst of challenges. It says that the disciples were glad to take him in. Like, oh, look, this is getting bad out here. Jesus, come on in. They were then carefree. In the midst of all the pain, the disappointments, the challenges of the world, we can have joy in the midst of them because of who Jesus is. Last thing we see is that Jesus delivers them to their destination. And it says, and immediately the boat was at the land which they were going. I don't know what's going on there. I don't know how. I don't know why. They're in the midst of a storm. Jesus ceases it, and then they're where they're supposed to be. He delivers them. Red Sea delivers them. The circumstances that are all of our need right now, guess what Jesus will do? Deliver us. How? I don't know. When? I don't know. But he promises to deliver us. In the confusion of this world, Jesus will bring us home. That's what he promises. I'll be with you in the middle of it, and I will bring you home. I will get you to the promised land. And so we ask ourselves, in the midst of our need, whatever your need is, what do you look to? You like me? Do you look to yourself like, okay, I just need to do more? Do you look at stuff? I just need to get more? Do you look to someone? If I just had them, they will meet my need. The call is to look to Jesus. He cares for us, he'll satisfy us, and he'll meet our needs and deliver us. Let's pray. God, the mission, the purpose of this church is to point our community to Jesus. I thank you for who he is, for the confidence that brings to stand here week in and week out and talk to a hurting, weak, sick, challenged world and be able to point to reveal, to show the one who cares, the one who satisfies no matter the circumstances, and the one who is the King who is working all things for his glory and for our joy. God, thank you for the cross, which is the center of it all. It shows that we can trust you, that you've taken on the needs of the world and overcome them to bring new life. So God, whatever the need is, some needs in this room right now I know are very great. They're very hard. Some of the needs in this room may not seem so great or so hard, but they're needs. This was lunch, and you cared about it. God, you care about us. May we turn to you. May we find rest in you and ultimately have life with you. In Jesus' name, amen.